The flight of tensions. The airplane cabin hummed with an undercurrent of activity as passengers stowed luggage, adjusted their belongings, and settled into their seats. Among them was the Matthews family, David, Maria, and their 4-year-old son, Ethan. It was their first family vacation in over 2 years, and though the anticipation of their destination buoyed their spirits, the effort of navigating the airport and managing a young child had left them visibly drained. David carefully stowed their carry-ons in the overhead bin before helping Maria settle Ethan into his window seat. The boy's wide eyes sparkled with wonder as he peered out at the ground crew preparing the plane for departure. Maria, with her soft-spoken demeanor, handed Ethan a small backpack filled with toys and snacks. "Remember, sweetie, use your quiet voice, okay?" she murmured, brushing a hand over his hair. Ethan nodded eagerly, clutching his stuffed dinosaur for comfort. Nearby passengers offered polite smiles, recognizing the Matthews as just another family embarking on a long journey. Most returned to their own distractions, phones, books, or the in-flight magazine tucked into the seat pocket. The atmosphere was calm, save for the faint buzz of conversation and the occasional clatter of luggage being loaded. At the front of the cabin, Julia Mercer, the senior flight attendant, adjusted her uniform with precise movements. Her years of experience showed in her efficiency, but today her usual professionalism seemed tinged with impatience. Julia had dealt with her share of unruly passengers and unpredictable scenarios, and while she prided herself on maintaining control, a restless energy flickered beneath her calm exterior. As the last passengers boarded, Julia made her way down the aisle, her sharp gaze assessing each row. When she reached the Matthews family, her eyes lingered for a moment longer than usual. Ethan's giggles as he played with his toy seemed to draw her attention. She noted David's backpack on the floor beneath his seat and Maria's soft reassurances to keep Ethan calm. Julia's expression tightened ever so slightly before she moved on. From the cockpit, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the final preparations for takeoff. Passengers secured their seatbelts and made last-minute adjustments. Julia finished her pre-flight checks and returned to her station at the front of the plane. Yet her thoughts drifted back to the Matthews family. Something about them unsettled her, though she couldn't pinpoint what. Minutes into the flight, as the plane reached cruising altitude, Julia received a report from a colleague that a wallet had gone missing from the first-class section. The owner, an elderly businessman, had alerted the crew after failing to find it in his seat pocket. Julia immediately sprang into action, her mind racing through possible scenarios. Determined to resolve the issue quickly, Julia retraced her earlier observations. Her thoughts returned to the Matthews family, particularly the moment she had seen David handling his backpack. The memory, vague and inconclusive, suddenly felt like a clue. Could they have picked it up by mistake? Or worse, taken it intentionally? Her lips pressed into a firm line as she marched down the aisle, her focus narrowing on the family. She stopped abruptly at their row, her presence casting a shadow over the quiet moment Maria had been sharing with Ethan as he colored in his travel book. "Excuse me," Julia began, her tone curt and unwavering. "Sir, may I speak with you for a moment?" David looked up, startled but polite. "Of course. Is something wrong?" "We've received a report of a missing wallet," Julia said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "I couldn't help but notice earlier that you were handling your bag. Can I ask if you might have seen or picked up a wallet that doesn't belong to you?" Maria's eyes widened in disbelief. "A wallet? No, we haven't seen anything. We've just been sitting here with our son." David straightened in his seat, his brow furrowed. "I haven't touched anything except our own belongings," he said firmly. "You're welcome to check, but I can assure you we haven't taken anything." Julia's posture remained rigid, her expression skeptical. "If you don't mind, I'd like to take a look," she said, gesturing toward the backpack under David's seat. Maria's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "Is this really necessary? We've done nothing wrong." "I'm simply doing my job," Julia replied coldly. If there's nothing to hide, this will be over quickly. David exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He leaned down and retrieved the backpack, placing it on the seat beside him. "Go ahead," he said, his voice clipped. Julia unzipped the bag with deliberate slowness, the sound of the zipper loud in the otherwise hushed cabin. Passengers nearby craned their necks, their curiosity evident as they whispered among themselves. Inside, Julia found Ethan's toys, a few snacks, and a travel-sized pillow. She rifled through the compartments, her movements methodical but increasingly tense. After several moments, she zipped the bag shut and stepped back. "There's nothing here," she admitted, though her tone lacked apology. David's expression hardened. "I told you that," he said. "Was this really necessary? You've embarrassed my family in front of everyone." Julia stiffened, her composure faltering for the first time. "I'll continue investigating," she said curtly before turning and walking briskly toward the front of the cabin. Maria's hands trembled as she reached for Ethan, who had begun to cry softly, clutching his stuffed dinosaur tighter. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured, though her own voice wavered. David placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his jaw still tight. "She had no right to treat us like that," he said quietly. "We didn't do anything wrong." From across the aisle, a fellow passenger leaned over and whispered, "That was uncalled for. I hope you report her." Maria nodded but said nothing, her focus on soothing Ethan. David sat back in his seat, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface as he glanced around the cabin, where more eyes than he was comfortable with were still fixed on them. At the front of the plane, Julia relayed the lack of evidence to her colleagues. Yet the seed of doubt she had planted lingered in her mind, even as the whispers of dissatisfied passengers began to reach her ears. The flight was far from over, and the consequences of Julia's actions were only beginning to take shape. Ripples of accusation. The atmosphere in the airplane cabin had shifted palpably after Julia's confrontation with the Matthews family. The usual hum of quiet conversations and the rustle of magazines had been replaced with an uneasy tension. Whispers passed between passengers, and sideways glances landed on the Matthews, some sympathetic, others laced with suspicion. David leaned his head against the seat, exhaling deeply as he stared blankly at the window. His thoughts swirled with frustration and disbelief. Maria sat beside him, her arm protectively draped over Ethan, who had quieted but clung to his stuffed dinosaur as though it were a shield. Her expression was a mix of humiliation and simmering anger. "This isn't over," David muttered, his voice low but resolute. Maria nodded, her fingers stroking Ethan's hair absent-mindedly. "She didn't even apologize," she whispered, her voice heavy with emotion. "She just walked away, as if we were nothing." Behind them, an older couple exchanged glances before one of them, a woman with a kind face and short silver hair, leaned forward. "I saw the whole thing," she said softly. "That was completely uncalled for. If you need witnesses, you can count on me." David turned, startled by the offer. "Thank you," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "We appreciate that." The woman nodded. "People like her shouldn't be allowed to treat families this way. You did nothing to deserve it." Across the aisle, another passenger chimed in. "It's disgraceful," he said, his voice rising slightly. "She had no evidence, just assumptions. I've flown dozens of times, and I've never seen something like that." The murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin, growing louder as passengers began to voice their displeasure. The support was a balm to the Matthews, but it did little to soothe the sting of the initial confrontation. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Julia stood near the galley, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She could feel the weight of the passengers' disapproval pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. Her colleagues, sensing the tension, gave her a wide berth. Even the co-pilot, who had stepped out of the cockpit briefly, shot her a questioning glance before retreating. Julia's mind churned as she replayed the incident over and over. Something about the Matthews family still felt off to her, or was it her own nerves? She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. She had acted out of caution, hadn't she? She had only been trying to protect the passenger's property. But the looks, the stares of disapproval, the whispers of judgment, gnawed at her. For the first time, she began to wonder if she had crossed a line. Her thoughts were interrupted by the junior flight attendant, Lisa, who approached hesitantly, her brow furrowed. "Julia." Lisa began cautiously, glancing toward the rows of passengers. "Maybe we should. Let this go. You've already checked their bag. The family doesn't have it." Julia's expression hardened. "It's not about letting it go," she said, her tone clipped. "A wallet is missing. That's serious." Lisa hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And accusing them like that, in front of everyone, that's also serious. You didn't even ask them politely. You just assumed." Julia stiffened, the words hitting a nerve. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'd like to thank you for your patience as we continue our flight to Los Angeles. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey." The captain's calm, measured tone seemed to soothe the cabin's tension momentarily. Passengers settled back into their seats, though the ripples of discontent lingered like an undercurrent. Julia turned away from Lisa, rushing past her to grab a bottle of water. Her hands trembled slightly as she twisted the cap off. "I'm just doing my job," she muttered under her breath, though the words rang hollow even to her own ears. At the family's row, David and Maria exchanged glances, silently debating whether to call for another attendant or let the situation rest for now. The support of other passengers had given them a sense of solidarity, but the sting of being singled out still burned. "I don't want her to get away with this," Maria said quietly, her voice laced with emotion. "Ethan doesn't understand what's happening, but he knows something's wrong. He knows we're upset." David nodded. "I won't let it slide," he said firmly. "But let's get through the flight first. We'll handle it when we land." As they spoke, Ethan looked up from his coloring book, his big brown eyes filled with curiosity. "Mommy, why was the lady mean to Daddy?" he asked softly. Maria's heart clenched. She forced a gentle smile, brushing his cheek with her hand. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, sweetheart," she said carefully. "But we're okay. Don't worry." Ethan seemed satisfied with the answer, turning back to his crayons. But the question lingered in Maria's mind. Mistakes were one thing, but Julia's actions hadn't felt like a mistake. They had felt deliberate. Julia's growing unease. At the front of the plane, Julia tried to busy herself with routine tasks, but her focus was fractured. She overheard snippets of conversations among the passengers, disapproving murmurs that she knew were about her. One passenger, a middle-aged man sitting near the aisle, stopped her as she passed. "Excuse me," he said, his tone sharp. "Do you always treat your passengers like criminals, or was today special?" Julia froze, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a response. I was just trying to ensure the missing wallet was found," she said weakly. The man scoffed. "By accusing a family in front of everyone, you should be ashamed of yourself." His words cut deeper than she expected, and for a moment she couldn't move. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced before. Julia turned and walked briskly back to the galley, where she leaned against the counter, gripping its edge tightly. Lisa approached again, this time more cautiously. "Julia," she said softly, "maybe you should take a step back. Let me handle things for a bit." Julia shook her head, her jaw tightening. "No," she said firmly. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. The weight of her actions, and their consequences, was beginning to press down on her. And deep down, she knew the flight wasn't the only thing at risk. Her reputation, her career, everything she had worked for, was hanging by a thread. The turning point. As the plane cruised toward its destination, the atmosphere remained charged. Passengers exchanged stories of previous travel mishaps, comparing them to the incident they had just witnessed. Sympathy for the Matthews family spread like wildfire, and the collective sentiment in the cabin turned against Julia. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain received an update from the ground crew about the missing wallet. It had been located, wedged in the seat back pocket of a first-class passenger, exactly where it had been left. The news sent a ripple of frustration through the cockpit. The captain turned to his co-pilot. "Well, that's going to be fun to address," he muttered. He picked up the intercom handset, preparing to make another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain again. I'm pleased to inform you that the missing wallet has been located and returned to its owner. Thank you for your cooperation and understanding." The announcement was met with a smattering of applause from the passengers. Relief mingled with vindication. But for Julia, the captain's words hit like a hammer. Her shoulders slumped and her hands fell to her sides. The wallet hadn't been stolen. It had never left the first-class section. Lisa approached her again, this time with a mix of sympathy and exasperation. "Julia," she said quietly, "you need to fix this. Now." Julia's throat tightened, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of what she had done. She nodded silently, her steps slow and heavy as she made her way back down the aisle toward the Matthews family. Whispers followed her, and she could feel the eyes of the passengers boring into her back. Stopping at their row, Julia took a deep breath, her voice faltering as she began to speak. "Mr. and Mrs. Matthews," she said softly, "may I have a moment of your time?" David and Maria both looked up, their expressions a mixture of surprise and guardedness. Julia hesitated, her carefully constructed facade cracking as she tried to find the right words. But before she could continue, David's voice cut through the silence. "Why should we give you the time of day?" he asked sharply. "You've already made your opinion of us perfectly clear." Julia's face flushed, and for the first time, she truly felt the consequences of her actions. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The ripple of the confrontation had reached its crescendo, and the fallout was only beginning. Confrontation in the skies. The silence between Julia and the Matthews family was charged with unspoken tension. David's words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Passengers nearby leaned in subtly, their curiosity outweighing their attempts at discretion. Julia's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her service tablet, a lifeline she no longer felt tethered to. "Mr. Matthews," Julia began again, her voice quieter now, almost fragile. "I came to apologize. I realize I made a mistake." David's eyes narrowed, his tone cold and precise. "A mistake," he echoed. "You didn't just make a mistake. You humiliated us, made baseless accusations, and terrified my son. And now you think a few words will fix that." Maria placed a calming hand on David's arm, though her own expression was tight with restrained anger. "You assumed we were guilty because it was convenient for you," she said, her voice steady but pointed. "You didn't ask. You didn't verify. You decided." Ethan, sensing the heaviness of the moment, tugged on Maria's sleeve. "Mommy," he whispered, holding his stuffed dinosaur close. "Are we in trouble?" Maria's heart clenched at the question. She leaned down to kiss his forehead. "No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble. Everything's okay." But it wasn't okay. The humiliation and fear Julia had caused still burned in their minds, and the growing murmurs of the other passengers only added to the weight of the moment. Julia swallowed hard, her cheeks flushed. "You're right," she admitted, her voice faltering. "I was wrong. I should have handled things differently, professionally. I let my assumptions guide me instead of following proper protocol. I'm truly sorry." David's gaze didn't soften. "Sorry doesn't erase what you did," he said. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to be judged like that? In front of an entire plane of strangers?" Julia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She had spent years in her role, priding herself on her ability to control difficult situations, to de-escalate tensions before they boiled over. Yet now, standing in front of the family she had wronged, she felt powerless. "Mr. Matthews, Mrs. Matthews," a calm voice interrupted. The second flight attendant, Lisa, stepped forward, her expression a mix of professionalism and quiet frustration. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but perhaps we could move this conversation to a more private area. The cabin is already tense." David turned to Lisa, his expression softening slightly. He glanced at Maria, who nodded. "Fine," David said curtly, "but I expect this to be handled properly." Lisa nodded, motioning for Julia to step aside while she led the family toward the galley at the back of the plane. Julia trailed behind them, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. She had to fix this, even if it was too late to undo the damage. Back in the galley, the hum of the plane's engines filled the small space as David and Maria stood with Ethan, who clung to his mother's leg. Julia and Lisa stood opposite them, the cramped galley making the situation feel even more claustrophobic. Lisa spoke first, her voice measured and diplomatic. "I want to start by sincerely apologizing for everything that has happened. This is not how we expect our crew to behave, and we take situations like this very seriously." Maria nodded, her expression unreadable. "We've heard that before," she said quietly. "But words don't mean much without action." Lisa hesitated, then turned to Julia. "Julia," she said firmly, "you need to take full accountability for this." Julia's throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet David and Maria's eyes. "I'm truly sorry for the way I treated you," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I judged you unfairly, and I understand how deeply I've hurt you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to hear it directly from me." David's arms were crossed, his expression still guarded. "And what happens next?" he asked. "Do you just walk away from this? Do we?" Lisa stepped in again, her tone more authoritative. "The captain is aware of the situation and has already escalated it to management. Julia will not be continuing her duties on this flight, and the airline will be following up with you directly once we land." Maria frowned. "That's not enough," she said. "This isn't just about her. It's about the culture that allows this kind of thing to happen in the first place. How do we know this won't happen to someone else?" Lisa nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Matthews. That's why this will involve more than just Julia. The airline will be conducting a full review of our policies and training procedures. I can't promise immediate change, but I can promise that your voices will be heard." David exchanged a glance with Maria, their shared frustration evident. "We'll hold you to that," he said finally, "because if we don't see action, this isn't staying private. People need to know what happened here." Julia felt her stomach twist at his words, though she knew they were justified. She had been so focused on resolving the immediate problem that she hadn't considered the broader implications of her actions. Now, those implications loomed large, threatening not just her career, but her understanding of herself. Lisa nodded, her professionalism unwavering. "I understand," she said. "If there's anything else you need during the remainder of the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." David and Maria said nothing more. With a final glance at Julia, they turned and walked back to their seats, Ethan holding tightly to Maria's hand. Julia remained in the galley, her shoulders slumping as the weight of the confrontation settled over her. Lisa turned to her, her expression firm but not unkind. "You're off duty for the rest of this flight," she said. "I'll handle the cabin. You need to start thinking about how you're going to make this right, not just with them, but with yourself." Julia nodded silently, her mind racing with regret and uncertainty. She had always prided herself on her ability to handle pressure, to be the voice of authority in challenging situations. But now she saw how that same confidence had blinded her, leading her to make a decision that had hurt innocent people. The passengers react. Back in their seats, the Matthews family tried to settle in as best they could. Maria helped Ethan with his coloring book, while David stared out the window, his jaw tight. Around them, passengers exchanged glances, and whispered conversations continued to ripple through the cabin. A woman sitting across the aisle leaned over. "I just wanted to say," she said softly, "that what you went through was horrible. I'm so sorry you had to experience that." Maria offered a small, tired smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It means a lot." Behind them, the older couple who had spoken up earlier nodded in solidarity. "You handled that better than most would have," the man said. "If it were me, I'd still be yelling." David let out a humorless chuckle. "Trust me, I wanted to," he admitted. "But what's more important is making sure they can't brush this under the rug." The passengers around them murmured in agreement, and the sense of unity in the cabin grew stronger. Though the Matthews family had borne the brunt of the ordeal, it was clear that many others shared their outrage and supported their demand for accountability. An uneasy descent. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the tension in the cabin began to ease slightly. Passengers adjusted their belongings and prepared for landing, though the events of the flight remained fresh in everyone's minds. Julia remained in the galley, staring out at the horizon through the small window. Her mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next. She knew the airline would launch an investigation, and she knew she would have to face the consequences of her actions. But for the first time, she also realized she needed to confront something deeper: the biases and assumptions that had led her to this moment. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. We thank you for your patience during today's flight and hope you enjoy the rest of your journey." But for Julia, the journey was far from over. And for the Matthews family, this was only the beginning of their fight for justice. The ground unravels. As the plane came to a halt at the gate, passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts and gathering their belongings. The Matthews family stayed seated, allowing the commotion to subside before they joined the flow of disembarking passengers. David held Ethan's hand tightly while Maria adjusted their carry-ons. Their expressions were steely, and their movements deliberate. The air around them felt heavier than usual. Despite the sympathetic nods and whispered words of support from fellow passengers, the sting of what they had endured lingered. Maria glanced at Ethan, whose wide eyes darted around curiously. The innocence of his expression was a painful contrast to the tension in her chest. "Ready?" David asked quietly, his voice low but steady. Maria nodded. "Let's get this over with." They stood, stepping into the aisle with Ethan in tow. Passengers gave them space, some going so far as to offer a small pat on David's shoulder or a whispered good luck as they passed. It was clear to everyone that the Matthews weren't just heading toward the baggage claim. They were walking into something far bigger: a corporate welcome. As they exited the jet bridge, they were greeted not by the usual bustling terminal, but by two uniformed representatives from the airline waiting near the gate. One was a tall man with salt and pepper hair, his badge identifying him as Martin Sharp, a regional operations manager. The other was a younger woman named Hannah, whose name tag marked her as a public relations officer. "Mr. and Mrs. Matthews," Martin began, his tone professional but laced with unease. "We'd like to speak with you about the events on your flight. Is there somewhere private we can sit down?" David's jaw tightened as he exchanged a glance with Maria. "We'll listen," he said curtly, "but we want you to know that we've already started documenting everything." Martin nodded, his expression remaining neutral. "Of course. This way, please." They were led through a side corridor into a small conference room, where 2 bottles of water and a plate of neatly arranged cookies had been set on the table. It was an attempt to soften the conversation, but it only underscored the awkwardness of the situation. Once seated, Martin folded his hands on the table. "First, let me start by apologizing on behalf of the airline," he began. "The experience you had on this flight is not representative of our values or standards." David cut him off. "With all due respect, we've heard that before. What we want to know is how you're planning to fix this, not just for us, but for anyone else who might be treated the same way." Maria, who had been silent up until now, leaned forward slightly. "What your flight attendant did wasn't a simple mistake," she said. "It was rooted in assumptions, bias. And when she realized she was wrong, she didn't even apologize. Instead, she doubled down and humiliated us." Hannah, the PR officer, nodded, her pen moving quickly across a notepad. "We completely understand your frustration, Mrs. Matthews," she said. "And I assure you, this matter is being taken very seriously. Julia Mercer has already been suspended pending a full investigation." Maria frowned. "Suspended isn't enough," she said. "She shouldn't have the authority to treat people like that ever again." Martin interjected, his tone measured. "This situation has escalated to the highest levels of management. Beyond the disciplinary actions for the crew member involved, we are reviewing our policies and implementing additional training for all staff to address unconscious bias and proper handling of passenger concerns." David's expression remained stony. "And what about us?" he asked. "What are you doing to make things right for our family?" Martin hesitated, glancing at Hannah. She placed her pen down and folded her hands. "We'd like to offer your family a formal apology in writing," she said carefully. "Additionally, we're prepared to provide full refunds for your tickets, complimentary first-class upgrades for future flights, and a significant travel credit." Maria exchanged a glance with David, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You think free tickets will make this better?" she asked, her voice heavy with disbelief. "This isn't about compensation. It's about accountability." David leaned forward, his tone firm. "We're not just going to let this disappear with an apology and some travel perks. The public needs to know what happened. People need to know that you're actually making changes, not just saying you are." Hannah nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "We understand," she said. "And we're open to discussing how we can ensure transparency moving forward. But we'd also like to ask for your discretion as we work through this process. The video circulating online has already created significant attention, and we want to avoid further escalation." Maria's eyes narrowed. "So you want us to stay quiet?" Hannah raised her hand slightly. "Not at all," she said. "We just want to ensure that the narrative remains accurate and that this doesn't devolve into unnecessary sensationalism. We're committed to addressing the root of the problem." David sat back in his chair, his arms crossed. "We'll think about it," he said after a long pause. "But we're not making any promises. The ball is in your court to prove you're serious about fixing this." The viral fallout. While the Matthews family was locked in discussions with the airline, the outside world was ablaze with their story. The video captured by a fellow passenger had spread like wildfire, gaining traction on social media and being picked up by major news outlets. The hashtag #FlightBS was trending, and the comments ranged from outrage to personal stories of discrimination. "Imagine accusing a family in front of an entire plane without proof," one user wrote. "This is why training on bias is so important." Another commented, "I've been there. It's humiliating. Glad this family is standing up for themselves." Amid the flood of reactions, Julia sat alone in her apartment, staring blankly at her phone. Her suspension had come swiftly, and now the weight of public opinion bore down on her. The video of her confrontation with the Matthews had been clipped and shared, and though she didn't speak in the footage, her presence was unmistakable. The comments were brutal. "She should be fired immediately." This is what happens when people are given authority without accountability. Julia's stomach churned as she scrolled through the reactions. She had spent her career believing she was a model of professionalism, but now her actions were laid bare for the world to see. And there was no denying what they revealed. Her phone buzzed with a new email from the airline's disciplinary committee. It was a notice for her upcoming review. The language was clear and unflinching. Her future with the airline was in jeopardy. Julia set her phone down and buried her face in her hands. For the first time, she felt the full weight of her actions, not just the professional consequences, but the personal toll on the family she had wronged. She had convinced herself she was just doing her job, but now she couldn't escape the truth. The Matthews' next move. Back at home, David and Maria sat at the dining table, reviewing the events of the day. Ethan was fast asleep in his room, his stuffed dinosaur tucked under his arm. David had his laptop open, typing out a detailed account of the incident for the airline's internal review. "I don't trust them to handle this without pressure," he said. "We need to make sure every detail is on record." Maria nodded, though her eyes were distant. "Do you think they'll actually change?" she asked softly. "Or are they just trying to keep us quiet?" David paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know we can't let them sweep this under the rug." Maria rested her chin in her hand, her thoughts heavy. "I want to move on from this," she said. "But I don't want to feel like we let her, or the airline, get away with it." David reached for her hand, his grip firm. "We won't," he said. "We'll make sure of it." As the night wore on, the Matthews continued their preparations, determined to turn their pain into progress. And in the days to come, their resolve would be tested as the full weight of the public spotlight and the airline's response came into play. The weight of public scrutiny. The following morning, David woke to the persistent buzzing of his phone. As he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, he saw the flood of notifications, emails, text messages, and news alerts. He groaned softly, already feeling the weight of the day ahead. Maria was in the kitchen, brewing coffee, and Ethan was at the table, happily munching on cereal. "Anything new?" Maria asked, her tone weary as David joined her at the table. David scrolled through his phone, skimming headlines that now prominently featured their story. Airline faces backlash after family humiliated mid-flight. #flight bias trending. Call for accountability in customer service. Parents speak out after being accused without evidence. He sighed and set the phone down. "It's everywhere," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Reporters, activists, even lawyers are reaching out. Some people are offering support, but others." He trailed off, unwilling to voice the uglier side of the internet. Maria nodded, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "I've seen the comments," she said quietly. "Most people are on our side, but there are always those who twist things." David leaned back in his chair, exhaustion lining his face. "We need to be careful about how we handle this. The airline reached out again late last night, offering to set up another meeting, but they also mentioned the video. I think they're worried about the bad press." Maria tilted her head. "Do you think they're trying to contain the damage?" "Absolutely," David replied. "But we can use that to our advantage. If they want to avoid a PR disaster, they'll have to take this seriously." Maria sipped her coffee, her thoughts churning. "What about Julia?" she asked softly. "Have you heard anything about what's happening to her?" David shook his head. "Not directly, but I did see something in the news about her suspension. People are calling for her to be fired." Maria frowned, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. "I don't know how I feel about that. What she did was wrong, horribly wrong. But I don't know if ruining her life is the answer." David studied her for a moment before speaking. "She needs to face the consequences of her actions, Maria. But this isn't just about her. It's about the system that let her act that way in the first place." Maria nodded slowly, though the unease in her expression remained. "I just hope something good comes out of all this." A formal hearing. Later that day, David and Maria received an official email from the airline, inviting them to participate in a formal mediation session with Julia and representatives from corporate leadership. The email emphasized the airline's commitment to resolving the issue and promised transparency throughout the process. David read the email aloud to Maria, who frowned thoughtfully. "Do you think this is a genuine effort, or just damage control?" she asked. "Probably both," David admitted. "But we should go. If nothing else, it'll give us a chance to make our voices heard." Maria nodded. "We need to make sure they understand how much this hurt us, not just the public backlash, but what it did to Ethan, to us as a family." The meeting room. 2 days later, David and Maria arrived at the airline's regional headquarters. They were ushered into a sleek, modern conference room where a long table dominated the space. On one side sat the airline's representatives, including Martin and Hannah, who had met them at the airport. On the other side sat Julia, her posture rigid and her face pale. David felt Maria's hand tighten around his as they entered. They exchanged a brief glance, then took their seats. Martin began the meeting, his tone serious but measured. "Mr. and Mrs. Matthews, thank you for coming today. We want to acknowledge the pain this incident has caused your family and discuss how we can move forward." David nodded but said nothing, his expression guarded. Hannah spoke next, her demeanor softer. "We've reviewed the details of the incident extensively. Julia Mercer has been suspended from duty, and the airline is conducting mandatory bias training for all staff. Additionally, we are implementing new procedures to ensure incidents like this are handled with greater care and professionalism." Maria raised an eyebrow. "And what about Julia?" she asked, her voice calm but pointed. "What's happening to her specifically?" Julia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Martin glanced at her before responding. "Julia's actions are under review by the disciplinary committee. A decision regarding her employment will be made soon." Maria's gaze turned to Julia. "Do you have anything to say?" she asked, her tone neutral. Julia took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "I don't expect forgiveness," she began, "but I want to say how deeply sorry I am for what I did. I judged you unfairly, and I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I know I caused you pain, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." David's expression remained unreadable. "And why should we believe you now?" he asked. "After everything, why should we trust that you mean it?" Julia's eyes glistened as she met his gaze. "Because I've spent the last few days questioning everything I thought I knew about myself," she said. "I thought I was a good person, a professional. But now, I see how much damage I caused by acting out of bias. I don't expect you to believe me, but I needed to say it." Maria's features softened slightly, though her voice remained firm. "What you did was wrong," she said, "but I hope you truly learn from this, not just for us, but for every family you interact with in the future." Public pressure. As the meeting concluded, David and Maria left the conference room feeling a mix of exhaustion and resolve. The airline had promised further action and asked the Matthews for their input on new training modules for staff. While it wasn't the closure they had hoped for, it was a start. Meanwhile, the story continued to dominate headlines. News outlets reported on the airline's response, highlighting the Matthews family's courage in speaking out. Activist groups began calling for systemic change in the travel industry, citing the incident as an example of broader issues with bias and accountability. David and Maria received dozens of messages daily, some from strangers offering support, others sharing similar experiences. It was overwhelming but also empowering. They realized their story had sparked a conversation far bigger than themselves. A personal decision. One evening, as David and Maria sat together after putting Ethan to bed, Maria brought up Julia again. "Do you think we did the right thing?" she asked softly, pushing for her to be held accountable. David hesitated, his gaze thoughtful. "I think so," he said finally. "She needed to understand the impact of her actions, but I don't think we wanted to destroy her." Maria nodded. "I don't either. I want this to lead to something better. For us, for her, for everyone." David placed a reassuring hand on hers. "It already has," he said. "Look at the conversations people are having because of this. Change doesn't happen overnight, but we've started something." Maria smiled faintly, leaning into him. "Then I guess we just keep moving forward." David nodded, one step at a time. As they sat together in the quiet of their home, the weight of the experience began to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose. The Matthews family had endured a painful ordeal, but they had emerged stronger, and determined to ensure no one else would have to endure the same. Ripples of change. 2 weeks after the incident, the Matthews family sat in their living room, finally able to reflect on the whirlwind of events that had followed. The house was unusually quiet. Ethan was asleep, his stuffed dinosaur resting on his pillow. The quiet offered a stark contrast to the chaos of the days before. David was seated at the dining table, typing furiously on his laptop. Maria sat nearby with a cup of tea, scrolling through her phone. Headlines featuring their story were still circulating, but now the tone had shifted. Airline implements new bias training following viral incident. Families fight for justice sparks industry-wide conversations. David leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "It's strange," he said, breaking the silence. "I never thought something like this could happen to us. And now, it feels like it's bigger than we ever imagined." Maria set her phone down and turned to him. "It is bigger," she said. "And that's a good thing. People are talking about it. Airlines are being forced to address things they've ignored for too long. We did what we set out to do." David nodded but frowned slightly. "I just wish it didn't have to come at Ethan's expense, or ours." Maria reached over, placing a comforting hand on his. "We're stronger for it," she said softly. "And we've made a difference." The corporate follow-up. The airline had followed through on its promise to keep the Matthews family updated. A formal letter of apology had been delivered, signed by the CEO, along with a detailed outline of the steps the company was taking. Mandatory bias training. Effective immediately, all employees were required to complete training designed to address unconscious bias and customer interaction protocols. Revised incident handling procedures. Clearer guidelines were implemented to ensure accusations or conflicts were handled with evidence-based decision-making, minimizing public humiliation. Enhanced accountability measures. A system for passengers to report incidents directly to corporate leadership was introduced, bypassing immediate crew judgment. The Matthews family had also been invited to serve as consultants for the training program. David and Maria were hesitant at first, unsure if they wanted to remain tied to the ordeal, but after careful consideration, they agreed. "It's one thing to criticize," David had said during one of their discussions. "It's another to be part of the solution." Maria had nodded, her resolve matching his. "If it means families like ours are treated with respect, it's worth it." Julia's reckoning. Julia sat nervously in the waiting area of the airline's headquarters, clutching a folder of documents she had prepared for her disciplinary hearing. The past 2 weeks had been a blur of self-reflection and public backlash. She had avoided social media entirely, but the snippets of news she couldn't escape had painted a clear picture. Her actions had left a lasting scar. When her name was called, Julia stood and entered the meeting room, where a panel of 3 senior executives awaited her. The atmosphere was sterile and intimidating, and Julia felt a sinking weight in her chest. Miss Mercer, the chair of the committee, began. "Thank you for attending. We've reviewed the incident on Flight 267 and the resulting fallout. This hearing is to determine the appropriate course of action regarding your future with this airline." Julia nodded, her throat dry. "I understand," she said quietly. The chair continued. "Your actions during the flight display poor judgment, lack of professionalism, and a disregard for the dignity of our passengers. These are serious breaches of our code of conduct." Julia swallowed hard. "I take full responsibility for my actions," she said, her voice trembling. "I made assumptions that I had no right to make, and I let my biases influence my decisions. I deeply regret the harm I caused." The panel exchanged glances before the chair spoke again. "Your apology is noted, but actions must have consequences. Effective immediately, your employment with the airline is terminated. Additionally, we recommend you seek professional development in bias awareness and interpersonal communication before pursuing further opportunities in customer service." Julia felt the air leave her lungs as the words settled over her. Though she had expected this outcome, hearing it spoken aloud was a sobering blow. "I understand," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for the opportunity to address this." As she left the building, Julia felt a mixture of relief and despair. Her career as a flight attendant was over, but the lessons she had learned, painful as they were, would shape her future. She resolved to take the panel's advice seriously, determined to grow from her mistakes. The Matthews family's advocacy. The Matthews family's involvement with the airline's new initiatives had turned them into reluctant advocates for change. David and Maria attended meetings, reviewed training materials, and shared their story with employees to help them understand the real impact of unconscious bias. During one session, Maria spoke directly to a group of new hires. "What happened to us wasn't just about one person's mistake," she said. "It was about a system that allowed assumptions to replace evidence, that allowed a family to be humiliated without accountability. You have the power to change that." David added, "Every passenger deserves respect, no matter where they're sitting, what they look like, or where they come from. Don't let assumptions guide you. Let facts and empathy be your compass." The room was silent as the trainees absorbed their words. It was a powerful moment, one that underscored the importance of the work the Matthews had chosen to undertake. A new chapter. Months later, life had begun to return to normal for the Matthews family. Ethan was back to his usual cheerful self, and the incident, though not forgotten, had become a part of their history rather than their present. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Maria noticed an envelope on their doorstep. Inside was a handwritten letter from Julia. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Matthews," it began. "I hope this letter finds you well. I've thought about you and your family every day since the flight. I wanted to write to you personally, not as an excuse, but as a way to express my deepest regret. Losing my job was the consequence of my actions, but it was also the wake-up call I needed. I've started taking courses on bias awareness and communication, and I've begun volunteering with organizations that support marginalized communities. Your courage to stand up for what was right inspired me to face my own flaws. I'll never forget the lesson you taught me. Thank you, and I'm sorry." Maria read the letter aloud to David, her voice wavering with emotion. When she finished, they sat in silence for a moment before David spoke. "She's trying," he said simply, "and maybe that's enough." Maria nodded, folding the letter carefully and placing it in a drawer. "We've all learned something from this," she said, "and maybe that's the real change." The legacy of Flight 267. What began as a painful and humiliating experience for the Matthews family had transformed into a catalyst for change. The airline's new policies became a model for others in the industry, and the Matthews story continued to inspire conversations about respect, accountability, and empathy. As David and Maria tucked Ethan into bed that night, they felt a sense of peace. They had faced adversity, fought for justice, and emerged stronger as a family. And though the skies could be unpredictable, they knew they had made them just a little clearer for everyone who traveled them.